The president has a negotiating strategy, which I would argue has been largely successful. We probably will disagree on this.
And his ratings, folks, not known. CNN had this. Thank you, CNN. His ratings have gone up in the last 10 days.
Well, I'll actually
Nobody knows that.
Well, I will say something else. If you look at the polling, Tom, the polling that's been good in 16, 20, and 24. Take Rasmussen, for example. Polling as of last night had the economy moving in the right direction at its highest reading in 16 years.
Yep.
So there's a lot of good stuff here. So I don't think there's a boy who cried wolf. This is a negotiation, and the intent and desire is to onshore and manufacturing high value added here. So that will ultimately be the president's decision, and Secretary Bessent will follow that.
Joe, Damian wants to get in here, but I got to follow that up as well. So we have a negotiating tactic. The Secretary of Treasury with David Weston here in exactly 2 hours. And then do you just presume there'll be some nice delay where we get a 60-day, 90-day delay?
Maybe, or there'll be a deal, Tom. There'll be a deal that is...
come on.
Let me say a framework, because people talked about the deals. I got all this pushback. The president's not going to pivot. You can't get a deal done. Yeah. It's a framework for discussion. I'm optimistic that it will be resolved in the U.S.'s advantage.
Can I define framework for you?
Yes.
A framework is where you're in negotiations to get afterthought to empty the dishwasher.
Joe,
that's what a framework is.
Joe, I'd love to get your opinion on the dollar as the world reserve currency. And the reason I ask it is this. I actually had long been a proponent of the fact that, the dollar, it's almost a bad thing for the Fed. It almost makes the Fed have to make decisions that are not necessarily based on the U.S. economy alone, but the rest of the world writ large, because of the dollar's influence of the world's reserve currency. Now that it seems to be, and again, I'm not calling for the end of King Dollar, but, some of the shine seems to be rubbing off of it here. Does the administration think that a weaker dollar is good for America?
The administration does not want to lose its reserve status. In certain instances, the dollar is artificially high vis-a-vis certain countries. But in general, no. I think a strong dollar is reflective of the fact the U.S. is basically the strongest industrial economy in the world from a GDP perspective and productivity perspective. Right. However, your Bloomberg audience and Tom Keene will love this. The problem with the Fed is this abundant reserve approach to operating monetary policy. We've got abundant reserves. I would move away from that and go back to the older system where the balance sheet's smaller.
Joe Lavorgna with us with SMBC Nikko Securities, part of the Sumitomo Group of Japan. We couldn't talk about Japan here, and with us, Damian Sassower this morning. Welcome across the nation. The Dow negative. My eyes are failing me, Damon.
Yeah.
I think it's negative 337 right now.
We have to ask you about Japan, the BOJ's role in the global financial system, the systemic risk of it being the net creditor to the rest of the world. And, now what we're seeing with inflation ticking up in Japan, do you think there's any real risk that a lot of those offshore holdings are going to need to be repatriated onshore? No, and you don't see...
we worried about Taiwan a few weeks ago. It's a nice Bloomberg article. I'll give you guys a plug. And how long did that last? There was issues last summer where this unwind. We had a big move in the Nikkei and JGB yields. By the way, JGB yields have been leading this recent rise higher, but it's also been globally, which is also, I want to push back against the narrative that the market's selling off. By the way, the market's exactly where it was a week ago before the Moody's downgrade, the surprise downgrade. But this isn't about the budget being big and causing the market to sell off. So again, the narrative, I think, is incorrect. But no, I'm not worried about systemic issues.
And why are we worried about the budget then?
Because that's just the easy, low-hanging fruit, simple narrative that people don't really have to think.
6% of GDP. But Japan equivalent debt and deficit, and I'm not worried?
The thing is, the numbers that are coming from CBO, Moody's apparently used CBO's numbers, Committee for Responsible Budget, they all use the same numbers. I don't think they're correct. I mentioned this maybe the last time.
You told the president that CBO's data is not correct.
The forecasts are unbelievably pessimistic, assuming 1.8% GDP growth the next 10 years.
So as Malpass would say, it's the growthiness that's not in there. Granted, you can't predict the growthiness, but you're saying we're going to have a sustained growth rate to get us through this agony.
Let's say we had growth at, say, 2.5%. I think we could be 3%, but let's say 2.5%. That's an extra $2 trillion in revenue. The tariffs, they're going to raise $200 billion this year. That's going to account for something over the next handful of years. That won't even be in the numbers because it's not part of the official scoring.